Ladies and gentlemen, it is November the 28th, 2021, and we're going to have another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith. I'm going to join voice with him, and we will discuss the world and other things. I'm going to sneeze. Shit! Do it over. We'll do the whole thing over. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. It's November the 28th, and I sneeze like a motherfucker. Hello?
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 Hey.
Hey.
What's up?
Not much, just had to redo the intro because I sneezed so bad.
My condolences.
Thanks. I'll use those condolences to recover from the sneeze. Did you have a good feast?
Sorry, what?
Did you have a good feast?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Thanksgiving.
we ate pretty well.
Do you have a favorite dish?
Not really. Just kind of eat what's out there, generally.
You're not the pickiest eater. A feast is a feast.
Food is food, especially when you don't have to pay for it.
True. Thank you to all the people who made food and didn't force everyone to pay for the meal for Thanksgiving. I too was in this demographic. People who ate food. I did help prepare it some, but yeah, I didn't have to pay a single dollar for the meal that I had. And it was a good meal. Mashed potatoes are always a very enjoyable thing. There was a big ham and some turkey. And I ended up slicing the ham because no one else wanted to. So that was fun. They said, "We don't care how it's cut." And I said, "Good, because I wouldn't know if you gave me instructions." And the world continued on. I didn't see any huge ticket items that jumped out at me, just the usual hustle and bustle and fuss. Plenty of saucy political news that's just meant to make people more divisive, but not too much substance to much of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't notice too much that jumped out at me either. Did you see the election going on in Chile?
I did not. Who are they electing?
Well, it's going to come down to a far-right candidate and a left-wing candidate. And I believe it was, here it is, Jose Antonio Cast. He's the far-right guy, and then he's going to run against a progressive politician named Gabriel Boric. And the runoff election that they're going to compete in is next month.
Is he a kind of right-wing populist kind of guy, or what?
From what I read, that's generally the description made of him. I don't know how far-right he really is. Because I don't think he's proposing to really necessarily change a whole lot. I think he's more of a... I think he's kind of... His support is more amongst people who are opposed to some of the changes that have been recommended, or maybe not recommended, but demanded by the political left in the country, especially after the protests in 2019, as well as the rise in crime in 2020. That's also putting a lot of people off. So that's more what he's running on, I think. Crime and opposition to expansion of government as proposed by some of the people writing the new constitution. And from what I read, the expectation is that he's going to win, although it's still possible he could lose. But in general, he's favored at this point. So we could have an additional right-wing populist president in the Western Hemisphere before too long. He's a little late to the party. Some of the other big names have already gone or are on the way out. Jair
And
Bolsonaro still in power, but there's an election coming up in Brazil, and he may or may not stick around.
because he would lose or because he wouldn't run?
Because he might lose. He's pretty unpopular in general amongst the broader part of the population at this point.
Because of his push-up form.
I don't know about that. I think in general it has more to do with the response to COVID. It's probably the main thing. But then also just the overall style of his presidency is very confrontational and has put a lot of people off. And there's also all the corruption with regard to the Amazon and to a degree corruption in general, although that seems to be kind of a constant in Brazilian politics. So I don't know how much of a problem that is necessarily. But yeah, he's definitely put a lot of people off at this point. He could still win. He does have sort of that anti-establishmentarian credential going for him.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if that's going to be enough to overwhelm everything that's happened over the past year and change in Brazil. Also, I think he's supposed to be running against Lula da Silva, the previous president. He was a well-known and very popular left-wing president for a long time in Brazil. To be fair, he was president during a time when commodity prices were rising. And because Brazil's economy is disproportionately dependent on exports of commodities of one sort or another, that kind of gave him a pretty strong economy to work with that people gave him credit for. He didn't necessarily have much to do with it, but he did oversee that, and he was given credit for it. He also did some popular stuff like social spending, social programs. I think the one that I generally remember the most is the one where he paid parents to send their kids to school. That was popular not just because it put money in the pockets of poor people, but also because it encouraged education. That was considered a relatively successful experiment at the time. So Lula could still have some of the old magic left and may be able to beat Bolsonaro. But there's been corruption allegations in the past targeting him as well, so we'll see.
It's not a question of is this person corrupt or is that person corrupt? The question is who is more corrupt of the two?
Yeah, least bad option, pretty much. But yeah, Bolsonaro loses, then pretty much Cast in Chile if he wins, and then President Lasso over in Ecuador will be, I think, the only right-wing presidents in the hemisphere. Well, no, that's not true, because there's some in Central America. So if we exclude Central America, then those would be the only ones. Yeah, I think Hernandez is still in power in Honduras. Costa Rica has one. He's the evangelical guy. And I'm not sure about the Caribbean. Actually, there's a whole bunch of countries in the Leeward Islands in the Caribbean that I don't follow very closely, so I don't know if any of them has conservative government right now. Yeah, people don't pay much attention to those. They're pretty quiet. Do you remember the, well, maybe not remember, but have you heard of the war in Grenada that the United States fought?
No.
That was back in the early 1980s. Grenada is a small island in the Caribbean. It's an independent country. It used to be a British territory, but they declared independence, I think, in the sometime in the 70s, I want to say. They ended up electing a government that was relatively left-wing, which wasn't like a big deal for a long time. But then what happened is that they started building an international airport. And one of the major funders of that airport was the UK. But of more concern to Washington was that another major funder was the Soviet Union. And there were some people in Washington that didn't really like that. So that kind of put the Grenadian government in the doghouse as far as the US government was concerned. But at first, the US government seemed like it was going to let it slide. But then there was a coup that overthrew the government. And so the socialist government was overthrown by left-wing radicals. And that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back as far as the US government was concerned. So after that, they launched an invasion of the island that nominally was geared towards evacuating US citizens. There were some US medical students who were studying there. But they also took the opportunity to remove the government that had seized power. It was not entirely unjustified or paranoid on the part of the government, because there actually were Cuban troops on the island that ended up surprising the US. The invasion was not particularly well planned at the time. I remember reading some trivia that one of the maps that they used for planning the invasion was actually like one of those tourist brochures, because they couldn't find an actual full map of the island like they needed. And so, yeah, that more or less went without a hitch. I mean, there was some hitches, but I think after like a couple days, they ended up removing the government and evacuating all US citizens. So it was pretty fast. But the British government wasn't very happy about it. Their attitude is that Grenada was a Commonwealth nation and that they should have been consulted about any potential action vis-a-vis the Grenadian government, which of course Washington did not do. I think the airport eventually got built later on. I'm not sure what happened to that. That was sort of that kind of got lost, I guess, in the news cycle. Yeah, another thing I remember was that there was, I guess, two things. One, there was a special forces group, contingent, if you like, that was dispatched. And I think they were supposed to seize like a radio station or something. But they ended up encountering a detachment of Cuban troops that actually had some armored vehicles. And the special forces troops weren't prepared for that. And so they ended up getting in a firefight that they had to retreat from. And they ended up retreating to the coast where they wanted to get extracted. But there was nobody to extract them. So they ended up having to swim back to their carrier that they had launched from initially. Again, not the most well-planned operation. There's some problems. The other thing I remember was that there was some helicopter troops. I know that's not the technical term, but there were some, I guess, Seahawks that landed some Marines on the island, and one of them had some kind of accident. I don't know if it was the wind or pilot error or whatever, but some of the blades ended up falling low enough to decapitate one of the Marines that was exiting the helicopter.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, kind of a mess. Anyway, those are just some snapshots. I don't really remember the full invasion. Obviously, the Grenadians didn't really have much hope of actually stopping the United States from successfully invading the island. But yeah, other than the couple of mistakes and mishaps that I mentioned, it more or less went smoothly. But yeah, that was the invasion of Grenada. And part of the rationale for that, part of the impetus for that, also was that the Reagan administration, which hadn't been in power for very long by that point, I don't think, they were pretty eager to exercise some force. I think I've read before that they were partly inspired by the Falklands War, in which the UK was able to kind of build, well, the Thatcher government specifically was able to build a lot of popular support, with successful military action. So it seems, from what I read again, it seems the Reagan administration was interested in doing something similar. I don't think they succeeded. I don't think anybody remembers Grenada particularly fondly, when they remember it at all, which is generally not the case. So mission not really accomplished in that sense, but that was also a factor. Again, not the main factor. They did have some strategic concerns there, and there was like a significant coup that happened. But, wars never happen in a vacuum. It's never just about strategy. Generally, there are some political calculations that go into them.
Guess you
So
don't
that
know
was
about
sort
the
of the,
vacuum wars.
sorry, what?
Guess you don't know about the vacuum wars.
I suppose not. But I don't think the vacuum wars occurred in the Caribbean,
That's
such
true.
as they are. But yeah, there's always some political calculus that goes in. And so that was just the context, the background context. But yeah, that was the war in Grenada in a nutshell. It's not one of the more well-remembered ones, but it is one of the two official wars, kind of wars that happened in the 80s that the US was involved in. I'm not counting like the tanker war in the Persian Gulf. That was kind of a pseudo low intensity type thing. Yeah, the other one was the invasion of Panama in 1989, I want to say. Do you remember that, Neuro?
The war in Panama, 1989. That's the year I was born.
Well, have you heard of it? I shouldn't say remember. Have you heard of the invasion of Panama in 89?
I've heard of it.
Yeah, that was a conflict in which the US was trying to remove President Noriega because he had been implicated in a significant amount of drug trafficking. And he had been a CIA agent, but it seems in 1989 that they'd gotten a little tired of him, basically. Besides the drug trafficking, he's also kind of a soft authoritarian leader, from what I remember. So the US removed him from power with a relatively quick military operation in 1989. Yeah, Caribbean was a pretty happening place back then. Well, I should say Caribbean and Central America. There was also the Civil War in El Salvador, the Civil War in Guatemala, which had been ongoing for decades. And then there was the Civil War in Nicaragua. So, all told, quite a bit happening.
Things have simmered down relative to then.
Oh, yeah, significantly so. The pretty much all of the civil wars ended. Uh, hasn't necessarily resulted in a significant improvement in stability per se. Some of those countries still have significant residual problems with weak governance and rampant crime, for example. But in general, they're significantly more peaceful in terms of conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of the Central American countries that had civil wars are sufficiently unstable now that they generate a lot of the immigrants that come into the United States. Uh, Significant amount of the immigration coming from Mesoamerica into the United States for the past couple of years has been Central American rather than Mexican. And part of it is just lack of opportunity, violence, what have you. And some of that is derived from the civil wars that were fought back in the day. Actually, MS-13, which is a well-known violent gang here in the United States, were originally started by refugees from El Salvador who had come up and been settled in Los Angeles back in the 1980s. And then eventually they were deported, because of involvement in violent activity. And they ended up taking basically their sort of gang ethos back to El Salvador, where they started up MS-13, local MS-13 branches. And so similar such gangs have been proliferating ever since, well beyond the government's ability to stop them. So there's still some residual linkages, basically, to the period we're talking about.
Yeah, the thing we talked about last week was building trust and how
Mhm.
for both individuals just amongst each other, but a government for its people, it takes a long time to build up trust, and it's pretty easy to lose trust by doing bad stuff. So in the case where there was a civil war, your whatever government ends up establishing itself at the end of that is going to be kind of at the 0 point for trust, especially since some people would have been fighting against that faction, but their side lost. So yeah, it makes sense that the stability score would still be low even if the full-on civil war stuff is subsided.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But also some of it was just pre-existing. Central America and, big chunks of Latin America in general have always had problems with state legitimacy, since they've always, well, almost always have been dominated by a small wealthy elite. Generally people descended from conquistadors or other European migrants. And they've never been particularly interested in sharing power. The result being that governments in Latin America rarely have the most legitimacy amongst broad swaths of the population. It kind of varies from place to place, but in general, that's the case. Central America is pretty bad because they've got significant landed elites, basically, and ruling families that have just kind of controlled politics for a long time. Countries in the Andes like Peru and Bolivia kind of have political problems that are almost more racial in nature. Because in Central America, most of the population is mestizo, it's mixed population. But in the Andes, there's actually still significant native populations that are not mixed. And so there's kind of an innate residual tension between Europeans and mestizos and some of the rural mestizos and rural native peoples. Because again, pretty much all of the national wealth is owned by that sort of small elite in those countries. And so that really kind of alienates the indigenous population, which is basically how, Chavista government like Evo Morales was able to come to power in Bolivia. Hasn't really happened the same way in Peru, and I don't know enough Latin American history to know why necessarily. If I had to guess, I would say that Peru has a larger middle class that's more opposed to Chavista-style politics. Because Lima is a pretty big city. It has something like 40% of the population of Peru.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking like the metro area of Lima. So that kind of weights the politics away from the Andes mountain regions where most of the natives are. So that would be my guess as to why Peru has different politics, but that's just a guess.
Do you know anything about the religion? Like, would people who are ethnically South American native, would they not practice Christianity? Because I think a lot of Central and South America would be Catholic.
Most of them are Catholic. Most of them were converted, hundreds of years ago. But there are still some native traditions that are maintained. And there has been something of a revival in the past couple decades of other traditions that haven't been practiced in a long time. Keep in mind also that when populations are converted to Christianity, and probably it's the same with any religion, but in this case, populations that are converted to Christianity generally do not see all of their customs and traditions obliterated and replaced with equivalent Christian customs. Rather, there's generally a blending.
Yeah.
So it's the kind of the same down there. So that's how you end up with like in Mexico, they have the holiday Day of the Dead. So that's kind of a fusion between Aztec and Christian theology. Or even Christmas. Christmas was originally, what was it, the Roman Winter Solstice Festival? Like one of the biggest holidays in the Roman calendar. And so the Christians basically just appropriated it and sort of changed the gist of it. They made it about Jesus instead of whatever it was about before. So, this kind of fusion is very common. So even if the native population of the Andes has mostly been converted to Catholicism, they still retain a lot of their original cultural identity and practices, albeit with slightly different names and labels and rationalizations.
Yeah, the Message tends to stick better if you say, no, you actually got this stuff right, but it was for this reason, not the reason that you thought. And like, oh, we don't have to throw out all of our existing stuff. We can just say, all right, we had half the picture and you gave us the other half, thanks.
Pretty much, yeah. It's a pretty effective strategy to proselytizing. Much more so than sort of the hammer approach, where you just tell them that they're wrong and going to hell and that they need to do what you say and change their ways.
Yeah, if you tell them they got everything wrong, a lot of times that just makes them more emboldened to be like, yeah, now we really need to stand out for ourselves.
Yeah, people are pretty resistant to substantively changing their culture, as we've seen recently in European and American politics. Quite a bit of that quite a bit of that present, rather. Whether it's justified or not, it's definitely a factor, and so that kind of underlines the point. Maybe it's also worth mentioning here that proselytizing was more effective in Latin America, partly also because the population collapsed because of disease and war and whatnot. And so that had a dramatic impact on the resiliency of local cultures and civilizations and whatnot. If they had not had that demographic collapse, then they might have been better able to preserve, even better able, rather, to preserve their culture. Because if you look at a place like South Asia, where there was significant European colonization and significant efforts to try to convert people to Christianity and even to go so far as to make them British, as one Governor General of British India once said, that effort was largely unsuccessful. And so the fact that it was kind of illustrates how large, strong cultures and civilizations are much more resistant when they're relatively healthy. That is to say, not plagued by massive pandemics that obliterate 90% of the population. So the fact that the culture in Mesoamerica and South America was sufficiently resilient, even in the face of losing something like 90% of their population, is a real testament to how much culture sticks over time. But yes, they're Catholic, to answer your question. I'll add the usual disclaimer here. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about, so if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me in chat. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will later. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody, and I do learn from chat. It's one of the things I enjoy about, doing the segment. So, if I'm saying something inaccurate about the religion of the Andes Mountain region, let me know, because I don't want to spout bullshit. When I give an answer and comment on things, that's my best effort, but it's not necessarily something I have a strong background in. So I welcome feedback. See, did you see the U.S. getting criticized for the health of its democracy?
No.
Yeah.
How unhealthy is it?
Debatable, but it's sufficiently of a concern that it's being commented on, which I haven't seen before. Always something new and exciting when you live in an era of change. So I have two items on this. One of them was the Halifax International Security Forum, which is not something I'd really heard of or paid much attention to. I've probably seen it in the news before, but it's just one of those minor talking shops that happens every year. And basically, it's a national security forum where representatives from different democratic governments come together to discuss common threats. Again, not that big a deal. Normally, they talk about stuff like China or Russia or what have you, and then just sort of coordinate in general what their respective nations are doing or thinking about those kinds of threats. So that's also what they talked about this year. But something new that they talked about was whether or not U.S. democracy was strong enough to make U.S. security commitments credible. Because at this point, there is some suspicion that the United States or at least large segments of the voting public in the United States, are not really fully on board with American security commitments. And that being the case, there is some concern then that allied nations may not be able to count on the United States in the future for defense. So, not necessarily a big deal by itself, but it is a signal that U.S. security commitments are coming under question, and that the health of U.S. democracy has reached a point where allied nations are willing to kind of criticize it in public, which they weren't really willing to do even during the Trump years. But now it's kind of more of an open question, because I think there was a hope, and we talked about this all through the Trump administration. U.S. allies and really just the rest of the world in general were probably not going to make significant changes to their expectations of the United States in terms of foreign policy unless Trump was reelected. If he was reelected, then that would mean the kinds of changes that the Trump administration was trying to implement were going to be not short-term changes and temporary changes, but long-term changes. So Biden defeated Trump in the 2020 election, and that being the case, there's a question then of whether or not this change is permanent, right? Because on the one hand, it could be that Trump was just a one-term president and that everything goes back to normal now. But it could also be that Trump comes back, or at least Trumpism comes back in some form in U.S. foreign policy. So what foreign observers have been watching in the United States is the degree to which Donald Trump and like-minded politicians and groups have stayed relevant to U.S. politics, and the degree to which they can credibly threaten to obtain power by way of the 2024 election. So if they had not been able to stay relevant to U.S. politics, probably things would have gone back to normal, but as is, that's not the case. And so as a result, it's still an open question as to whether or not the United States is going to maintain its traditional global security commitments, or whether or not it's in the process of withdrawing from those commitments. And until that question is more clear cut, we're going to see more criticisms like this. You know, if the U.S. didn't have any security commitments, they wouldn't care about the health of U.S. democracy, and it wouldn't be really worth talking about. But as is, there's this lack of predictability as to U.S. intentions that is of concern. So they're trying to get some certainty, basically, in their foreign relationship with the United States. So that was one item. The other item was a report from an NGO in Sweden called the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. And, you know, this is just one of many pro-democracy NGOs like this that basically monitors the health of democracies around the world and tries to critique them and offer them advice on how to improve, criticizes problems, and also goes out of its way to generate data with which to analyze different political systems, different democracies, rather, around the world. So in their report, they noted that the overall, basically, score that they gave the United States was falling, and that it was not falling across the board, because, you know, they based the score on different measures. You know, it's kind of an aggregate index that incorporates a number of different measures. And so they noted that impartial administration, one of their measures, had actually improved. So in terms of corruption, well, not impartial administration had improved, but the quality of U.S. democracy had declined in terms of civil liberties and predictable enforcement. Predictable enforcement refers to basically the degree to which the government enforces the law. And so that kind of ties into the degree to which executives of one sort or another have kind of been increasingly selective about how they enforce the law. Basically, it refers to the reliance on executive orders on the part of the executive branch. And that's kind of been a long-running trend over time. But that's not necessarily the most healthy way to run a democracy. Ideally, major executive action would be couched in legislation rather than executive fiat. Fiat. Not sure how to pronounce that.
Fiat.
Fiat, thank you. So that's been another source of criticism here of the U.S. political system. So I guess you can file that under the category of if you live long enough, you see everything. Yeah, whether or not the decline is arrested or not is basically just going to be a function of U.S. politics and whether or not substantive reforms are implemented. Anybody's guess as to whether or not that happens. I remember uh, after the Biden team, after Biden was elected, let's say, um, there was some talk about implementing some significant political reforms as far as improving access to the ballot, making some electoral changes, etc. But it seems that that legislation largely fell by the wayside. It's basically taken up the Democrats, let's say, in the Congress and the Biden administration. It's taken all of their political capital since he's been elected just to try to get the infrastructure plan passed and probably the Build Back Better plan, which has not technically been passed yet, but it did pass the House recently. So now it's going to go to the Senate. I have a hard time seeing it not getting passed. I feel like they just kind of have to do that at this point, politically speaking. It's probably going to get watered down pretty significantly, but I have a hard time believing it won't pass eventually. Probably in December, I would guess. But anyway, just doing those two things has taken up a lot of bandwidth, and they haven't really had time to do much else in terms of broad-based reform. So I suspect then that probably won't be significant such reform after the midterm elections next year, since the Republican Party will probably get the House at least in that election. That's generally the broad-based expectation in the United States at this point. So after that, 2024 then would probably be the earliest it could happen. And of course, there's going to be a presidential election that year, which is going to be a whole circus unto itself. So yeah, it's going to be a while if it happens at all, basically.
And by circus, you mean another presidential ad campaign, complete with what a person could call a debate, or you could not call it that.
Well, the debates, I mean, have always been well, maybe not always, but have been a joke for a long time. But the bigger factor that makes it a circus is the fact that it lasts, that is to say, the campaign for the president lasts 2 years, which is ridiculous. You know, in most countries, an election will last, a campaign for an election will last like a month, maybe. You know, maybe not even that, depending on the country. But here in the US, the political system has evolved such that it's turned into a 2-year slugfest.
And is the benefit of that that you can work on wider reach if you have more time to tour and campaign?
Yeah, you get your name in the news, you build political capital. It gives you a slight advantage over other people who get into the race later.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because the media is going to start reporting on it as soon as anybody starts running for president. So if you can get your name in the headlines, you get that name recognition, which is helpful. But it doesn't just have to do with the candidates themselves trying to run earlier. It also has to do with institutions like the primaries. You know, I think it was Iowa and then Florida, maybe? I can't remember who else it was, but basically, Iowa historically has always had the earliest primary, but then some other states tried to schedule their primary first because they wanted to basically obtain that role as being the first litmus test that filters out candidates. And sometimes they've had reasons for doing that. You know, Iowa doesn't necessarily have demographics that reflect that of the United States as a whole. So other states argue that it would be better to have their primary first so that they can kind of be that litmus test for that, the first litmus test rather, for the candidates. But then Iowa doesn't want to give up, you know, the prestige that comes with being first. So whenever somebody else tries to move ahead of them, they'll reschedule their primaries earlier, and that's led to a tit-for-tat series of retaliations that have steadily moved that primary further and further ahead of the election. So that was another factor that's contributed to making the election cycle much longer. But you could also say it has to do with money. You know, campaigns have been getting more expensive, and if you start up earlier, you can do more fundraising, basically. You know, hypothetically, you could start fundraising without officially running for president, but I imagine it's much harder to get money in that case. Canada does it better. Canada will announce an election, and then like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is later, they'll have the election, and then it's done. Much more sensible, but to be fair, they have a very different political system than the United States does.
Yeah, and the population is pretty different.
Yeah, population is smaller, and I guess it's not more homogenous per se. It's actually pretty diverse. But in general, yeah, the population is smaller, and they have a parliamentary system where it's pretty normal for governments to just kind of call elections whenever. And so it kind of makes sense then to make them shorter. So I guess you could say having a fixed election date like the United States does also incentivizes earlier campaigning.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you don't know when exactly the election is going to be, it's a little bit risky to start running beforehand because you don't know if it'll ever actually happen. You know, you may run for president thinking the election is going to be a month away, but then maybe it's actually like 4 years. So it makes more sense to wait for the announcement of an election in that sense. Let's see. Did we talk about China's hypersonic weapon test?
No.
Yeah, this happened a couple weeks ago.
Faster than sound.
Supersonic is faster than sound. Hypersonic is
way faster than sound. So fast that
Yeah,
sound
well,
gets self-conscious.
pretty much. I think it's 8 times the speed of sound or above. Something like that. I don't remember the technical definition. But yeah, hypersonic weapons have been a major item of interest for countries around the world for 10 some years now. I mean, they've been researched for way before then, but there's been a particular rush to develop them in the past 10 years. And the United States is actually behind technologically, since Russia and China have been investing a lot in these. And so there was a hypersonic weapon that China tested that entered the stratosphere. And that kind of caught people off guard and led to some hand-wringing about whether or not the United States should be investing more money in it. The United States, the commentary was a little overwrought because the weapon that the Chinese tested was not like a hypersonic cruise missile. It was actually just a weapon that they launched into orbit, and then they used basically the orbit to move the weapon. Or, well, not use the weapon. Rather, they shot it off into orbit. And so once it reaches orbit, of course, it moves very quickly. And at that point, it can just orbit around until it reaches whatever target it's supposed to get to and then release its payload. That kind of technology is not actually new. That's actually existed for a long time. And it was of interest back before there was a significant early warning radar system that could detect the launch of nuclear weapons. There were some radar systems the United States had built. Well, there was actually a whole line of radar systems the United States built in Canada in order to detect Soviet bombers that were expected to fly over the North Pole in the event of a war. So what the Soviets did then is they designed a missile. The radar could detect missiles too, or at least one of the later versions of it. So what the Soviets did is they developed technology like this so that they could fire the nuke into orbit, and then it would enter orbit and go south, down across the equator, and then around the South Pole, and then up north over South America, and then hit the United States from the south, which would circumvent the early warning radar stations the United States had installed up in Canada. So they did develop that technology, but eventually the United States developed new early warning technology, satellites, and other better radar systems and whatnot. So Eventually, when the United States did that, the technology obsolesced and people stopped really caring about it. But it's always existed, that's always been an option. And basically, it's that technology that the Chinese were actually testing. So the media was a little bit misguided, a little bit incorrect in saying that, it's a brand new hypersonic weapon that they've developed. Yeah, another thing I read is that they had like the device, if you want to call it that, weapon or device or what have you, had like a compartment in it that was apparently designed to carry something that could be fired from the front of the missile. This isn't like a payload, this isn't like a nuclear warhead like you would find in a ICBM. What I was reading suggested that it was actually a countermeasure, as in if something like, say, a missile were fired in order to shoot down the weapon, then the weapon would be able to defend itself by using this thing, whatever it was that they were trying to test. So a countermeasure like that would be useful if you were trying to overcome anti-missile defenses of one sort or another. So it could be that that was the bigger innovation here, but it's also not clear if it actually worked or how effective it is or what have you. So in general, it's true that the Chinese are ahead of the United States in the development of hypersonics, but it's also true that this isn't necessarily an example of that. So basically, the media just wanted to make an excuse to complain. Oh yeah, and Russia shot down a satellite. Did you see that at all?
No. Why did they do that?
It's basically just a test. The weaponization of space is something that has been accelerating over the past 5 some years. We talked about it a couple of years ago, but haven't really picked up on it much since then. But everybody and their mother pretty much at this point is investing in it. And, it makes sense. The United States is pretty heavily dependent on space-based communications and reconnaissance and what have you. And it gives the United States military an advantage. So developing anti-satellite weaponry just makes sense. So Russia tested an anti-satellite weapon and successfully blew it up, much to the chagrin of the people on the International Space Station, who had to go and hide, apparently, in one of the station's lifeboats because of the debris.
Whoa.
There was some concern that the debris caused by the explosion may do significant damage to the station, and so they had to kind of go into hiding in preparation for a potential emergency drop.
That's pretty intense.
Yeah, space is actually a pretty cluttered place right now. There's been so much debris ejected into orbit around the Earth that it's actually kind of risky. And there's actually a project I think I remember reading about where they were basically giving out a reward to anybody who could develop a system that would clean up all the debris, or at least help clean it up. I think there was some kids somewhere in North America that won one of them.
Mm-hmm.
They had some nifty little system, kind of a satellite cleanup system they developed that would automatically go and try to collect debris.
That's how you get the creative and competitive spirit engaged. Incentivize people, make it a contest. Man, this ocean sure is heckin' messy. Contest, whoever can clean it up the best wins. That's how you get the right and the left excited.
Oh yeah, it actually does work. That's how the X Prize worked for a long time. Just offer up a huge chunk of money to anybody who can develop the technology, and invariably you get some takers. See, there's been some drama in Sudan lately. Have you heard anything about that?
Didn't we mention that the other week? Or I'm thinking of Somalia and Estonia. Not Estonia, sorry. Ethiopia.
Yeah, we did talk about Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know if we mentioned Sudan specifically. We talked about it back in 2019. That was when there was big anti-government protests that brought down the government. That was the government of Omar Bashir, if memory serves. He was kind of an Islamist, but he wasn't an ideological Islamist like some of the other Islamist governments have been in the region. He was just more about the power, pretty much, and he had basically what amounted to a power sharing agreement between his own political party and the military. The protests successfully ejected Bashir from power and marginalized his party, but the military still remained a significant political player. And so what happened is that there was an agreement between the military and the protesters in which they would share power for a couple of years as part of a transition government until elections could be held and a new democratic representative government could be elected. So they were going to, I think, alternate power. I think it was going to be like the general would be president first for 2 years, and then there would be a transition to one of the civilian leaders that was part of the condominium that they had agreed to. And then after 2 years of that, then they would have the first election. So they were set then for the military to hand over power to the civilians in their power sharing agreement. But then there was a coup, basically. The military just decided they weren't going to do that. And so they put, I think, the principal civilian leader under arrest and dissolved the government and just kind of took power for themselves. Yeah, there had been hopes that there would be a successful democratization, but it's looking like it's very much in doubt. It doesn't help that the economy has not been very good in Sudan. And so the transition government has not been very popular because it's been unable to deal with economic problems. And there's also been unrest amongst an ethnic minority group in the east of the country that's been disrupting the country's principal rail connection to the outside world. Now,
That would be
Sudan
Port
has a
Sudan.
narrow coastline, and so that's where they import most of their stuff.
That would be Port
Sorry, go ahead.
Sudan. I pulled up the
Sorry.
map. So there's Port Sudan, which goes out into the Red Sea, which I'm
Oh,
guessing is
yeah.
what you're referring to. Probably a couple ports along the coastline here. Just geographically, with all the green, I'm guessing this is mostly desertous here in Sudan.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's very arid, and most of the population is just clustered around the Nile River. I think you've seen like a demographic density map of Egypt. Like you
Mm-hmm.
could see how dense the population is around the Nile, and then there's virtually nothing outside of that.
Yeah.
The Sudan is the same way.
Hmm. Yeah, because the Nile continues down this way.
Hmm. Yeah, there was even some question after independence as to whether Egypt would annex Sudan, because for a long time Egypt had actually claimed it as part of their territory. Didn't end up happening. I don't think the British were interested in facilitating that. But there's always been strong similarities between Egypt and Sudan. Common Arab culture, similar demographic disposition, etc. Sudan is just poorer and it doesn't have the benefit of having the Nile Delta, which is the most developed part of Egyptian territory.
Yeah, and I'm
Now,
guessing the Nile River Delta just has more overall water in it compared to
well,
just
it's
any other
more,
part of the river.
the land is more productive because the soil there kind of it's silt basically.
Mm-hmm.
And also there's lots of, basically it's just a natural location for a port. So the city of Alexandria is located there, and so that was a natural point at which to focus economic development. That's also not far. I think Cairo's in the Delta too, isn't it?
Cairo in the river Delta?
Yeah, I think so.
Heck yeah, it is. It's basically right where the river Delta begins.
Okay.
If I'm just looking at the reference of where the map is green. Green is lush, is good. Means you can grow stuff.
But yeah, there was some big protests in Sudan in response to the coup. And so the military has kind of walked things back a little bit. They've allowed the civilian leader that they had deposed to step into the presidency. So technically he's in power now, but whether or not the military actually listens to him and respects his authority is very much in question at this point.
People are unhappy about the coup.
Unsurprisingly.
Why did you take over our government? Oh, because we could. We're the ones with guns. Well, we don't like you.
Yeah, monopoly on violence will do that.
Yep.
You can get away with a lot when you got that.
Yeah, I guess the reason why it ends up being passed to people in suits is because it's kind of tedious and boring and difficult in more technical ways than just getting people to shut up. Because at a point, you have to have people go back to work and be economical and productive so you can grow and society can move forward. The sit down and shut up takeover approach is pretty stifling of human progress and enthusiasm.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty blunt instrument. If you want to do that, you've got to really stick it through. You're going to have to commit some violence, basically. It's much easier just to give a little, make some concessions, reach an agreement, what have you.
Yeah. That's a fun thing that you get to notice whenever you play CivX builders or whatever, is you often have the happiness stat of populations in either a region or on a planet if you're playing like Endless Space or something, and how the planets or the regions are more productive if they're happier. So how much do you prioritize that? And it's beneficial to keep them happy, even for selfish or self-interested reasons for governing.
Yeah, the question is, how substantive is that effort? Like, if the government is kind of giving concessions, are they legitimately giving concessions, or are they just stringing you along to keep you pacified?
True. Campaign promises.
Well, in the case of Sudan, the suspicion is that the military is just giving superficial concessions. Like, they're not actually sharing power. They're basically just trying to get people to stop protesting. So it remains to be seen just how substantive the power sharing agreement really is at this point. I mean, given that they've already staged a coup, you really have to question their commitment to the agreement. But the civilians don't really have the power to kind of just eject them from power. They're just kind of stuck with them.
So we'll see what happens there. We did mention in a previous episode how it's difficult to build legitimacy for yourself as a government too, especially if you do a takeover kind of thing. It's usually not looked at too fondly. Have there been any updates in Ethiopia?
Not really. Nothing that stood out to me anyway. Yeah, it's not clear to me that the TPLF is really pushing on the capital, at least not yet. So they may be trying to reach some kind of political deal with other groups in order to heap pressure on the government. I really don't think they want to seize a large city like that. Just taking it at all would be a problem, let alone holding it.
Why would it be a problem to take it?
Just overcoming resistance from the Ethiopian military would be difficult. They may well be able to beat them. They've already done it, but that incurs casualties, and it costs money, and it's a logistical problem. They're operating outside of Tigray territory right now, and advancing on Addis Ababa would just put them even further away from their base of supply. It extends their supply chain, basically, which both makes them vulnerable and is difficult to maintain. And of course, if they take the city, then they're responsible for it, and that just comes with a whole another set of logistical problems. So yeah, I think they would much rather put pressure on the government than actually take anything. But it's not clear that the Ethiopian government can exploit that to its advantage because its army is so weak right now. They just have been mangled so many times by the TPLF. The last big development I remember reading is that the government was asking people in the capital to mobilize. I don't know if that means necessarily to join the army, but they were asking everybody basically to get their gun and be prepared to defend the capital. Desperate measures and all of that.
There's a bit of overlap between war and StarCraft conflict in that it's usually easier to do an attack, especially a small-scale attack at a location, than it is to defend that location against the many different kinds of attacks that could show up. So you're saying it would be difficult to take and then keep the city, because then you're transitioning not just from could we rush in and grab this territory versus once we have it, they're probably going to make some plays to try to get it back. How are we going to manage all those? That gets pretty complicated pretty fast.
Not quite what I'm saying. I don't think the Ethiopian army could necessarily take the city back if they lost it. Such as their weakness right now. The problem for the TPLF in taking the city is that they would have to feed all of the people there. Oh. And they don't have that kind of supplies, right? Because even in the Tigray province right now, they've been cut off from the rest of the world by the Ethiopian army, which is blocking off trade routes. So they haven't had the fertilizer necessary in order to grow their crops, and so they are undergoing something of a minor famine right now. So if they were to take the city, then they would be responsible for governing it, providing security, and again, feeding the population. And I don't think they have enough troops to provide security for a city that big. And even if they did, they definitely don't have the supplies necessary to provide for everybody in the city. So taking the city would be very problematic logistically for them for those reasons.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, we could kick their butts, but we don't have enough bread.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, this is actually part of the reason the siege of Leningrad happened back in World War II. The Germans didn't want to undertake the expense of having to take care of everybody in the city, so they figured it would be better to starve everybody out in a prolonged siege. That was the logic in 41 anyway. They did make some dedicated attempts to seize the city a couple times later on, but at first anyway, the initial plan was just to starve the city into submission.
Mm-hmm.
They were also planning on turning Moscow into a lake.
As in,
have you heard that?
Blowing it up, or like actually making a lake?
No, they were literally going to flood the city. They were going to basically build a big reservoir that would submerge the entire city, such that it wouldn't even be on the map anymore.
Whoa! To make a statement, or they just
pretty
really wanted a lake?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, their whole attitude towards Eastern Europe was very imperialistic.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason they called it Lebensraum. That was going to be land that the German race was going to expand into and settle. Not much sense in maintaining any symbols or signifiers of the old order in that case.
Yeah, they wouldn't really place too much stock in trying to maintain local traditions.
Yeah. Let's see. So we did have some questions. Do I know the current situation of Hong Kong? Are there still protests, or were they defeated? They were defeated. It's pretty much over at this point. The protests were kind of at their height in 2019, but then with the COVID-19 outbreak, the government in Hong Kong put a bunch of restrictions on, well, basically COVID restrictions. They locked down the city such that it was pretty much impossible to legally protest anymore. And so as a result of that, the protests largely disappeared, and in the months after that, the government took the opportunity to impose a bunch of new laws on Hong Kong that basically made it illegal to challenge the Chinese government's supremacy over the city. And those laws were interpreted in a way that they were applied against anybody who protested against, potential reforms to the city, like people have been protesting in 2019. Yeah, 2019 had to do with an extradition law that was being proposed. And so everybody came out against that because they didn't like the idea of people potentially being extradited from Hong Kong into China, where they don't have rule of law like Hong Kong does. So what they've done instead in 2020, what they did instead in 2020, is that they passed a national security law in Hong Kong that was actually imposed by the Chinese government. And that law basically gives the liaison office that is run by Beijing significant influence in how judges are appointed. It also created a new national security court in which those judges would be appointed. And that court, of course, is very hawkish as to how they interpret threats to public safety. So basically, anything that questions the Chinese government's control over Hong Kong, or that suggests any kind of separatism on the part of Hong Kong, or basically just anything that seems unpatriotic in general, technically falls under the purview of the law. And of course, it's interpreted very broadly. So what's been happening since that law has been implemented is basically a series of arrests targeting the protesters from 2019. And they've also been going after some institutions, like, for example, there was like a museum of Tiananmen Square, like the Tiananmen Square massacre, so that was shut down. And there was, I think, some bookstores that shut down. Basically anything that could be connected to dissent against the Chinese Communist Party has been de facto targeted. And at this point, you can't really protest without being arrested under the law, so the protest movement has largely been tamed at this point. It's unfortunate, but it was probably inevitable. It was always a stretch that protesters in Hong Kong would be able to beat mainland China, just given the immense power disparity.
They put up a good fight, though. You were talking before about how they, compared to other protest movements, did a better job with kind of connecting with local businesses and winning more just general public enthusiasm in the region on it.
Yeah, they were good at operating on the media. They were good at keeping the movement decentralized, so there wasn't any single organizer that could be arrested, thereby crippling the movement. They were pretty disciplined, relatively speaking, in terms of not like fighting people or committing acts of violence. There were some that happened, but in general, they were pretty good on that. Yeah, I think the fatal mistake for them was that they got hung up on the police response, which I think is not generally the way to go. I can understand why they did it, but I think it was ultimately a distraction. I think they would have been better served trying to keep the focus on the government itself rather than the police specifically. But even if they hadn't, it's not clear to me that they would have ended up getting the concessions they wanted. To be fair to the Communist Party of China, to be fair, they did not gut Hong Kong's rule of law completely. They have largely maintained the independent judiciary. They've just expanded basically the national security laws to the point where they can be applied very broadly and ambiguously, which means that Hong Kong is not necessarily all that different than something like, say, Singapore, which is technically democratic but has some authoritarian illiberal elements to it. So Hong Kong is not completely authoritarian yet. It's more kind of in a middle ground. And that middle ground is actually pretty common to the region. So it's not a complete implosion yet of democratic rule of law in Hong Kong, but they are kind of on track at this point. And it's still not clear just what kind of plans the government has for after 2047, which is when the 50-year hiatus ends. Technically they promised the British after that, well, before the handover of Hong Kong, that they would maintain Hong Kong's distinct political system for 50 years after the handover. So they've still technically been adhering to that. The national security law was a bit of a bending of the rules, but technically that was allowed as well. So we'll see what happens in 2047. They could hypothetically just full on annex the territory. Or more accurately, they could strip it of its autonomous status. Technically, it's already a part of China. Let's see, have I been following terrorist attacks in Africa and whether there's a trend I'd like to comment on? I noticed Togo had their first one in recent times. I guess I didn't see the one in Togo. But yeah, there's been a bunch of terrorist violence in the Sahel, which we've talked about before. That's sort of the Sahel is sort of the region that is the transition zone between the Sahara and the southern coastal region of West Africa. It's kind of a semi-arid region. And there's been a lot of Islamist slash banditry going on there. Well, Islamist violence slash banditry going on in the Sahel that's been escalating in tempo for the past 5 years. So that's not really new per se. That just has to do with economic conditions and weak rule of law. You know, their governments out there are fairly corrupt and generally lack the capacity to significantly respond to large uprisings, even if they are sort of more criminal and disorganized in nature, as the bandits in northern Nigeria are, for example. So they've been pretty dependent on outsider help to try to suppress those expressions of either extremism or banditry again. But I think this person is more asking about the suicide bombing that actually happened in Uganda last week, which was very strange. There's been violence in Uganda before. That's actually where the Lord's Resistance Army was fighting for a long time. But this was actually a jihadi suicide bomber that blew up, I think it was like a government building or something. I don't remember exactly what it was. But it was pretty unusual because Uganda doesn't really have a lot of Muslims in it. They're a pretty tiny minority. And Uganda hasn't really gotten too wrapped up in international operations like Afghanistan or whatnot. They do have some peacekeepers in Somalia. And I would have to guess that the jihadi in question was probably most upset about that. But other than that, I can't really imagine why else anybody would want to commit a suicide attack in Uganda. It seems like a weird choice to me. But I don't know if it's happened enough at this point to be considered a pattern. You know, that suicide bombing last week was, I think, the first one they've had in a while.
I pulled up the map here. Uganda's got Kenya to the east, Democratic Republic of the Congo to the west, Rwanda to the southwest, Lake Victoria to the south and east.
Yeah. Yeah, it's heavily Christian. Must be like 90% Christian. So it kind of surprised me to hear them in the news like that. But yeah, beyond that, I don't think that there's a trend in terrorist attacks that I could point to beyond that was already pre-existing anyway in the Sahel. You know, the Sahel has a very clear pattern of terrorist attacks at this point. Eastern Africa, where Uganda is, not so much. It would have to happen more for me to see a pattern there. I suspect this is kind of more of an isolated incident, or maybe just Al-Shabaab. I guess you could say Al-Shabaab constitutes the pattern in East Africa. I guess that's a fair point. Let's say there's no pattern of terrorist activity in the Great Lakes region of Africa, which Uganda is technically in. But yeah, in the Horn of Africa, yeah, there's definitely violence there. There's also been some violence in Mozambique, specifically the northernmost province, Diego del something. I can't quite remember the name of it. But they have a majority Muslim population there, and it's the territory there has been ignored by the government for a long time. And so people have gotten more desperate over time to the point where Islamic, I don't want to say terrorism per se, because I think they are actually a rebel group rather than just pure terrorists. But they have been committing acts of terror, so you know they are terrorists as well. But in general, there's an Islamist rebel movement in this province in northern Mozambique, and they've been committing lots of particularly heinous acts of violence because they're actually associated with Islamic State. So any group that is of like mind with the Islamic State is invariably going to commit heinous acts of violence just for the sake of it, pretty much. That's kind of their modus operandi.
Yeah, we talked about that with sort of the history of radical jihadism and how that rose over time. And one of their strategy points is just be so brutal and violent that it scares people into joining their side.
Yeah.
Because making recommendations and pitches for it didn't work. So they're just going to keep turning up the heat. I don't know if they noticed, but that strategy has not worked on a broader scale. People don't really like it when you do brutal and heinous acts of violence, because then you get a bunch of bad guy points.
Yeah, the Islamic State's experience in the Middle East being the punching bag for everybody and their mother should really illustrate that to everybody, but some people just enjoy the game a little too much. So the Islamic State hasn't really changed tack, strategically speaking, in that sense. See. So the next question was, have I heard of the Chinese non-cell enzyme carbon capture method? And if so, does he think it's viable? I have not heard of that. This sounds very technical, and so that's kind of outside my purview a little bit. I'm guessing this is something like where they capture the carbon emitted during production, and so instead of going into the atmosphere, they're able to store it. Is that the kind of technology it is? I'm assuming that's the case. So if somebody could develop that kind of technology, that would be of significant help in terms of curtailing emissions if they could do it, profitably and efficiently. So if that's what this is, then hey, more power to them. Certainly the Chinese government has been investing in green technology a fair bit. It's a part of their industrial policy. But I don't know if this is an example of something they've invested in, or just something an individual researcher has done, or if it's even commercially viable yet, or what have you. So I'd have to read more about it. But thank you for letting me know. It'll be something interesting to read later.
One of those easy questions where it's like, Neuro, what are your thoughts on blah, blah? And it's like, well, my initial reaction is, what's that? And now I've heard of it, but I didn't know about that before.
Let's see. What's the latest with the Taliban?
Yeah, so they took over. How is it going?
Poorly.
It's going poorly. Why?
Oh, man. I mean, basically all the stuff we talked about before has just continued to play out. So, for example, the Afghan economy was disproportionately dependent on foreign aid during the war. So after the war, when the Taliban seized power, all of that foreign aid got cut off, or at least most of it. And so the result is that the Afghan economy has entered a recession, a significant one. It's also meant that the financial sector in Afghanistan does not have very much liquidity in it because they don't have any foreign currency coming in by way of the foreign aid. And so Afghan business, such as it is, has been having trouble getting financing. So that's also contributed to the decline. There's also been a drought, which has been ongoing, and so that's created a lack of food, which again, the foreign aid might have helped with, but since they don't have that, there are growing famine conditions around Afghanistan. So between food shortages, liquidity shortages, and a lack of their principal economic driver, again, foreign aid, the Afghan economy ain't doing too good.
Man, I'm getting flashbacks to like 30 minutes ago when you were just talking about the reason they don't take the city is because they don't have enough food to feed the people there.
There you go.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so case in point. So people are not too happy about it. But as of yet, the regional warlords that the Taliban made de facto truces with in their final offensive have not yet risen up against the Taliban. It's not clear if they will. There has been some tension within the Taliban. I think the Haqqani network has come out as sort of the most powerful faction. But not everybody is happy with that. The Quetta Shura Council and their people within the Taliban would prefer to have more, I think, Islamist style government, but the Haqqani network is kind of more practical. Generally, they've just been more about power for the sake of it. So there's a little bit of tension there. And there's also been some protests in Kabul, most of which have been put down violently. But in general, they don't entirely know what to do with the city, because it's a lot bigger than it was way back when the Taliban were last in power in the 90s. And so governing a city that big is kind of beyond their ability. And they've sort of been at pains to try to figure out what kinds of rules to implement, what kinds of administrative state to create, etc. I think they did just recently pass a rule preventing women from being on television, something like that. No surprise, but I've noticed that they've kind of they've been very slowly rolling out Islamist type policies like that, rather than just dumping them all on the city at once. So I don't know if they're doing that because they're afraid there will be a revolt, or if they're only doing that because they just don't have the ability to enforce rules very broadly yet. So in which case, maybe they're just slow rolling the new reforms as they increase their capacity. So there's been some political infighting, in other words, and there's been some protests in Kabul, in addition to the economic damage.
Man, what kind of a priority system is that? You're not able to keep up with the food demands of the country, and you just did a hostile takeover of the existing government, and someone's like, man, this is a tough situation. What should we do? Well, there are women on TV still. Right. But what is that related to? Well, don't you think that's a problem? No? What the heck?
Yeah, they're a little out of their depth a bit at this point. But it won't necessarily matter either, because they've already kind of got the countryside, that is to say, the rural areas. It's kind of more the urban areas where they're the most unpopular. There is some growing dissent amongst veterans, because they haven't really been paid substantively like they thought they were going to be. You know, they kind of expected rewards, and that has not been forthcoming. So that could result in banditry, and the warlords at any point could just decide that the Taliban are sufficiently weak to challenge them. But that has not yet resulted in significant violence. And again, since they're generally considered the better option, you know, as far as comparison with the previous regime, they've still got some residual legitimacy stemming from that to work with. So we'll see. It's kind of up in the air right now as to what'll happen. We don't know if the country will descend into civil war again, or if people will just starve and just not really have the energy to do anything, or if maybe Afghanistan will get significant bailouts from, say, Pakistan. I did note that India and Pakistan reached a deal to allow Indian food aid to reach Afghanistan through Pakistani borders. So that could offer some relief to the problem. But it remains to be seen if that will be enough. I suspect Pakistan is only doing it because they want to support their proxy. There's been a lot of schadenfreude on the part of Pakistani media as far as the U.S. loss in Afghanistan, and the Afghan intelligence agency, the ISI, has been pretty quick to establish relations with the new government beyond the ones they already had anyway, and has been trying to offer them support intermittently. Yeah, that's about all I have to update on. It's just kind of a messy situation. I don't think if I had to guess, I would say the Taliban will be able to hang on, but there's going to be a lot of unhappy people. But I don't think those unhappy people will be able to coordinate into a organized revolution, say. You know, at most, I would expect something like banditry. But we'll see. That's speculation on my part. Let's see. Next question. A few weeks ago, there was a bunch of stuff about increased tensions between China and Taiwan, but I haven't heard anything since. Anything new? Let's see. Mostly it's been diplomatic posturing. I think a week or two ago, the Chinese government issued a warning to the United States government to mind its own business and stay out of the Taiwan issue. But that's not anything different than what they've been doing for the past month and well, even for the past couple months. Yeah, it's more about posturing at this point than anything. It's not really something that I think either side really takes all of that seriously. And I think here and then the Chinese Air Force will buzz Taiwanese airspace. They've been doing that more than they have in the past. There was I guess it's not Taiwan, but there was a flotilla, let's say, of Russian and Chinese ships that sailed through the Straits of whatchamacallit.
The Straits of whatchamacallit?
What Straits of... I can't remember what it's the strait that separates Hokkaido Island from Honshu Island in Japan. I'm looking it up. But I'm using Google Maps, so maybe they won't have it. No, it doesn't look like they label it. Well, anyway, they sailed through there, and that's actually legal. You know, there is kind of an agreement in place to allow ships, even warships, to sail through that strait as needed. But it was considered a signal, basically, to Japan. And Japan, for its part, over the past year, has been sending signals that it would support Taiwan and that it backs it backs the status quo anyway, vis-a-vis Taiwan and China. So China and Russia were sending a signal there, and that happened relatively recently, sometime in the past couple weeks. So there's been some flashing of hardware here and there, but I don't think I've read anywhere that there's any expectation amongst military analysts that they're actually planning an invasion, at least not yet. So most of what's been happening has been diplomatic messages just throwing weight around. I did note that the United States actually started sending military personnel to Taiwan in order to help train people in the Taiwanese military. So that was a pretty significant step. I don't want to say escalation, but it was a significant response to the uptick in Chinese pressure. So the United States has definitely been keeping pace in terms of tit for tat. But yeah, other than just diplomatic spats and, you know, the occasional symbolic measure, I don't think there's anything substantive happening lately. That's pretty much still all talk.
Talk is cheaper than a military campaign.
It sure is. Let's see. In places like Afghanistan, are the cities parasitic or revenue producing? So the real answer to this question is I don't know, but I would assume that they're revenue generating. In general, whenever you have big cities like that, they generally generate more tax revenue than they take in. And that's, you know, especially in the case of a developing country, the state generally doesn't have the resources to provide a lot of public services, either at the municipal level or the provincial level. So the cost is not necessarily as high as you might think. So in general, yeah, just having a lot of people in one place engaging in relatively more advanced economic activity than agriculture invariably generates a lot of tax revenue. And I believe it is in the surplus in the vast majority of cases. So yeah, the cities are definitely worth holding in the sense that they'll generate a lot of tax revenue. But the trouble is, if you want to extract that tax revenue, you need to have an administrative state that is sufficiently organized that it can actually do that. And it's not clear to me right now that the Taliban have that. I remember a couple months ago, they were even asking people who had been civil servants in the government to come back and work for them because they didn't have the administrative know-how in order to run the state bureaucracy. They were offering amnesty. But the trouble is that there's been enough violence by some of the more radical factions in the Taliban that offers of amnesty are not entirely credible at this point. What are the major differences between the Taliban and ISIS? ISIS is way more violent and way more poorly organized than the Taliban. ISIS is all about symbolic violence that's designed to shock you and make you frightened. And it's also about recruitment. They commit heinous acts of violence in order to try to get in the news or to make videos that terrify enemies and excite allies, so to speak. The Taliban is a lot more grassroots. They've got a much better ground game, so to speak, politically speaking. They've organized people at a local level, and they were basically able, in most of rural Afghanistan, to create a shadow government that successfully governed territory, often in competition with the state, but sometimes where the state wasn't absent, they were just the sole authority. So the fact that they were able to organize a de facto shadow government and the fact that they were able to run a successful counterinsurgency campaign really speaks to the degree of organization that they were capable of. And in turn, another reflection of that organization is that they had concrete strategic objectives. The offensive that they launched that ended up winning them the war basically was not like an impromptu. It was organized and it was planned in advance. And it ended up being more successful than they were expecting. I think everybody was shocked at the speed with which the Afghan government collapsed. But even so, the fact that they had planned successfully and well enough to be in a position to take advantage of that collapse when it happened speaks well to their ability to plan large offensives involving large numbers of troops. It takes organization to mobilize people and get them in place and coordinate their actions so that they time them correctly. And so they were able to do that. So that's, I think, those are the principal differences between the Taliban and ISIS. One of them is significantly more organized than the other and much more focused, whereas ISIS is just more like the Islamist drama queen of the Islamist world. They do a lot of dramatic things, but they're not actually that successful at producing results.
And the Taliban was trained at least partially and equipped from other militaries coming in from outside the country when they were fighting off the Soviet Union. So they have more experience in their leadership, you could say.
Yeah, you could say that. I don't think ISIS in Afghanistan really has a lot of veteran fighters yet. I don't know that they've been able to attract any significant veteran warlords, for example.
No, I mean, but Afghanistan had more. The Taliban had more experience.
Yeah. But keep in mind, the Taliban did not fight in the war in the 1980s. They did not technically exist yet. They didn't actually enter Afghanistan until after the war in the 1990s, where they acted as a Pakistani proxy. And a lot of their members were actually originally Afghan refugees who studied in Pakistani madrasas. But a lot of the warlords that ended up fighting with the Taliban did fight in the war, and so, yes, the Taliban do have significant experience. Much more so than ISIS. It's also worth mentioning that ISIS has a much more extremist vision of Islamist governance than the Taliban does. It's kind of the difference between fascism and conservatism, the two of which are often conflated. In the Taliban's case, their vision of Islam is basically just the traditional form of Islam that has been common to rural Afghanistan for a long time. Granted, it's a much more austere conservative version than most people in rural Afghanistan may necessarily want. But all of the stuff they do is familiar, at least. It's if you can say that there is a political spectrum along which rural Afghanis fall, Taliban Islamism is definitely on the spectrum. It's on the right wing of the spectrum, but it's at least familiar to people there. The version of Islamism that is advocated by ISIS is not even on the spectrum. It's like this weird new thing. It's very much an authoritarian statist version of Islamism. So it's not really conservative per se. It's actually kind of a change from the type of Islamism that existed before. Yeah, fascism is inherently revolutionary, and it is totalitarian statist in character. The fact that they prop up conservative notions of the role of religion, the role of women, generally, I guess technically you don't have to do that stuff to be a fascist, but we associate those things with fascists. So that being the case, wait, where was I going? But yeah, it's totalitarian in nature. The elements of conservatism inherent in fascism are largely coincidental. They're more just things you use to get into power, basically. Conservatism can be authoritarian or totalitarian or statist or all three, but it is not inherently. So, conservatism just refers to basically traditional values, politics, etc. So if you want an example of this that kind of shows the difference, you can look at the Civil War in Spain. The right, so to speak, the conservatives in the Spanish Civil War were led by General Franco. And General Franco was not actually a fascist. He's often accused of fascism because he's an authoritarian conservative, and he killed a lot of people. And he was allied with well, not allied with the Nazis and the other fascists in Europe, but he was certainly aligned more with them. But technically speaking, not technically a fascist. And there was actually a political party, because there was, Franco's conservative movement that he led was actually a coalition organization that included different conservative groups in Spain. And there was actually a fascist group in that coalition, and I think they were called the Falange, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe we have somebody from Spain who can correct me on that. But the Falange were just like a full-on Spanish fascist political party. But they were not the most powerful party in the coalition. In fact, they were actually one of the more weak ones. Generally, the stronger factions in their coalition generally were just Catholics. That is to say, conservative Catholics who wanted the Catholic Church to continue to have a strong role in society. A very strong role by contemporary standards. They wanted the church, for example, to continue to be responsible for public education and to continue to own land and to be the principal landlord of many regions, that kind of thing. The church used to be very powerful in Europe. So they wanted to kind of maintain those institutions and that traditional role for the church. There was also a faction that were Carlists. This is kind of a weird one. So there was a royal family that governed Spain for a long time, but eventually they lost long story short, they lost a power struggle and they were replaced with a Bourbon line, a Bourbon dynasty. But some people thought that the Bourbon dynasty was illegitimate, and they continued to argue that the previous dynasty was the legitimate, true line that should govern Spain. And so those people were actually still a significant political force, enough that they could comprise a major political faction in the conservative coalition in the Civil War. And actually, they ended up getting their way. When the conservatives won the Civil War, they actually took a descendant of that previous royal line and made him king. He was actually very young at the time, so he ended up having to basically concede power to the general, General Franco. But eventually, he did come of age and was granted the crown. And interestingly, he was not himself an authoritarian. He actually supported democratization in Spain in the 1970s. So even though General Franco, of all people, was his regent, and he was educated in a authoritarian conservative country, when he became king, he was actually something of a liberal. Interesting twist of fate there for those people fighting to put him on the throne. But anyway, long story short, fascism and conservatism are not the same thing. They overlap with each other, but in Spain's case, you can see very clearly that there were political differences between them and that they had an alliance of convenience against the Republicans. So that's kind of, to bring this full circle, the difference between the Taliban and ISIS. The ISIS are a revolutionary new force that's trying to introduce a radically violent form of Islamism, whereas the Taliban are more just traditionalists. Let's see. Do I think there's any truth behind the theory that a major catalyst for the Syrian civil war was drought? Or is this more likely to be an explanation people came up with after the civil war was already broke out? We actually talked about this. I guess it's been a couple years, but yeah, drought is actually one of the major factors. Um, there's more to it than just that. It wasn't the drought by itself. Rather, what happened is that the drought interacted with major discontent over inequality. Uh, what happens in a lot of countries with planned economies, which is not, Syria didn't quite have a completely planned economy, but it had a very strong role for the state. And what happens in a lot of cases like that is that a lot of the development is focused in very particular regions or even cities. And generally that's to the detriment of development in rural areas. And there are different reasons for that happening. Part of it is just because the ruling power, the ruling faction in charge of authoritarian governments generally prefers to focus resources and development in areas where their core supporters are. It's also because urban areas are generally already more built up and have some of the resources and capital necessary for further development. But regardless, generally rural areas are ignored, and a lot of people are upset with the subsequent inequality that results from that. And it doesn't help that in the case of Syria, a lot of people in the rural areas were Sunni Muslims, whereas the principal ruling cohort, if you like, were of a different sect. They were, oh hell, what were they?
Shia?
Alawites. That's what it was.
Alawites.
Yeah, not General, Bashir al-Assad, the dictator in charge of Syria right now, is an Alawite Muslim, and in general, most of the people in government are Alawites. That's a legacy of French colonialism. They had always kind of been a marginal group in Syria, but when the French came in after World War I, they basically cut a deal with them in which they would give them disproportionate access to education and business deals and whatnot. And in exchange, they would be basically loyal proxies of the French colonial state. So as a result, they ended up with a lot of wealth and power in Syria, and they've continued to basically be the principal ruling class of Syria ever since. So the thing about Alawite Muslims is that they've always been seen as kind of a weird fringe sect in Islam, to the point where, very conservative Muslims don't even really consider them Muslim. And historically, that hasn't been too much of a problem, because generally people are relatively chill unless instigated. But the trouble is that the authoritarian government has been pretty violent. There was a major uprising against the government in the 1980s. And unsurprisingly, that was centered in the east of the country, which, one, again, was economically underdeveloped, and two, was more conservative religiously, to the point where they didn't really like the fact that Alawite Muslims were running the country, let alone that they were committing acts of violence against them while they were trying to fight for equality. So the regime was very unpopular after that, and since then, well, in the 20 years since then, the government tried to implement some reforms, tried to open up the economy a little bit, tried to improve relations with the West, kind of successful, but then the drought hit. And the drought, of course, disproportionately affected the rural areas of the country where people already had lots of reasons to dislike the government. So between the inequality and the drought, that made for very fertile territory for unrest, which is what we got after the Arab Spring. So people there already just hated the government, basically. They didn't need a lot of reasons to rise up. And when the rest of the Arab world started to rise up, that inspired the dissidents in Syria to do the same, which is where we get the Syrian civil war. That's kind of a Cliff Notes version of events, but yeah. Basically, I want to just illustrate here that it's not bullshit that the drought contributed to the civil war. It actually was a significant factor there, albeit indirectly.
Well, a lot of change, I think, generally happens at a critical mass of discontent, which is going to be based on a variety of factors, usually not just one particular thing. So yeah, the drought would have been a factor in this.
I think that's all we had for questions. Are we doing okay on time?
Yep.
Well, we started at 8 o'clock, so about an hour left.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, we had a Oh, we had another one. Okay. Do you think if the Vietnam War never happened, Korea would still be a country rather than North and South? Do you mean the Korean War? What is the Vietnam War? That's an interesting question. If the Vietnam War never happened, I don't think it would have made a difference to Korea. Now, if the person is asking if the Korean War never happened, would it still be a country rather than divided? That's a more interesting question. Well, keep in mind that the Korean War actually happened after Korea was divided, not before. Oh, okay, I got the correction. That makes more sense. But yeah, it was divided before the Korean War happened. And it was because of that division that technically the Korean War ended up starting. Because the Northerners didn't want, well, neither one of them wanted a divided Korea, but they disagreed on about which regime it would be united under. And so the North Koreans decided to settle that violently with predictable results. But let's hear it. So the question was supposed to be, do you think the Korean War, no, if the Korean War never happened, wait, would Korea still be a country? I guess I'm still confused then. Yeah, reverse it. If the Korean War never happened, would Vietnam still be a country rather than, well, it's not divided anymore. I guess I'll add here, if I ever don't understand a question and I don't answer it to your satisfaction, please feel free to elaborate and I'm happy to return to it. I'm not the brightest sometimes and I can miss something. Well, if the question is, if the Korean War never happened, would Korea still be divided? Then yes, because it was already divided even before that. So that's sort of the short Cliff Notes answer to that. Now, I think maybe the question you were getting at is, if the Korean War never happened, would the Vietnam War have happened? So that's an interesting question. I think yes, probably, because they were separate events. But you could argue that if the Korean War had not happened, then maybe the United States would not have been as committed to defending South Vietnam as it was. Because after World War II, the United States was actually demobilizing its military in large part. It wasn't actually that interested, or more accurately, the public in the United States was not actually interested in maintaining a large overseas presence. You know, the negotiation of NATO was a case in point. You know, the Europeans really had to give a lot of concessions in order to convince the United States government to stay in Europe. That was actually one of the big quid pro quo in the negotiation of NATO. Because the United States was willing to sign the Mutual Defense Treaty that created NATO, but it did not want to maintain troops in Europe. And a lot of Europeans were afraid that maybe if they came under attack by the Soviets, then the United States would not actually intervene on their behalf, unless they already had troops on the ground who were being attacked by the Soviets. So they wanted American troops to be stationed in Europe. So the concession they gave is to water down the language of NATO. So the Mutual Defense Agreement undergirding NATO does not say that the United States has to defend NATO members if they come under attack. It only says that they have to consider action in response to an attack on a member state. So that kind of waters down the commitment a little, but in exchange, the Europeans were able to extract a commitment from the United States to maintain troops in Europe. And the thinking was that those troops would act as a tripwire, where if they came under attack, then the United States would invariably be committed to defending Europe. This is actually one of the reasons why it's been so important over the course of NATO's existence for the United States to be very vocal about the nature of its commitment to Europe. Because again, technically, we don't have to fight for them if they come under attack, according to the agreement.
We just need to consider it for at least 45 minutes.
So that means if, say, a president were to suggest that maybe the United States would not fight for them if they came under attack, that would be a significant red flag. Because technically there's nothing illegal about that statement. That would not technically breach the agreement if we did not fight for them if they came under attack. So the credibility of the agreement rests very heavily on the signals that the US government sends that it will commit to defending allies that come under attack. But yeah, after World War II, basically, that's just all meant to illustrate how reluctant the US public was to commit to overseas security commitments. So the Korean War really helped kind of change public opinion. To a degree, it had already been changing. There was a number of confrontations with the Soviets over the course of the late 1940s. There was disagreements about how to manage occupied Germany. There was the whole Berlin airlift thing. There was a lot of problems like that. And of course, there was Czechoslovakia having its government de facto overthrown. That wasn't really a surprise. It was in the Soviet sphere of influence, so it's kind of what was expected, but the broader public was very upset about it. So there was already kind of a sense that the Soviets were a threat, but not necessarily enough of a threat to warrant a large standing military. So what ended up happening is the North Koreans invaded South Korea, and that was kind of a clarion call to mobilize the U.S. military and maintain a large U.S. military, just in case there was some kind of communist aggression somewhere in the world. So in that sense, North Korea's invasion of South Korea helped set a precedent that facilitated later U.S. intervention in South Vietnam. So maybe if not for that, the U.S. public still would have been pretty reluctant to get involved, and maybe they wouldn't have been as interested in fighting in Indochina. But I still think they would have anyway, because one of the things that happened contemporaneously with the Indochina War, which was the sort of predecessor conflict to the Vietnam War, was that France's government was very unstable, and it wasn't clear that communists would not become popular enough to win power in an election, or maybe even seize power. And so maintaining the popularity of conservatives in France was kind of considered a strategic priority for the United States. France is obviously was at the time and remains a major ally of the United States, and losing them to the Soviets would have been a significant strategic blow. So one of the things roiling French politics in the 1950s was the loss of colonies, specifically colonial wars. They were fighting against nationalists in Indochina and also Algeria. And the prospect of losing those colonies was very upsetting to French conservatives. And of course, the United States wanted not only to keep them happy, but also to make sure that they had enough political credibility to stay in power. And so for those reasons, the United States supported the French war effort in Indochina, if not also Algeria. I'm not as familiar with the Algerian conflict. But the United States did not participate directly in the French war in Indochina, but it did fund them. I think something like half of the financial cost of the war was paid by the United States government. So that's why the United States kind of got involved in the conflict in the first place. It actually originally had more to do with France than it did necessarily with Indochina. Now, as it happened, the French ended up losing the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which was the battle in which their army was basically defeated in Indochina, and the result was the Treaty of Paris, in which Indochina was granted its independence, and in which Vietnam in particular was cut in half, with North Vietnam going to the Vietnamese nationalists, the Viet Minh, and the southern part of Vietnam becoming an independent country that was not run by the French, but it was kind of run by Vietnamese elites that were more aligned with the French. So basically your rubber barons and other major landowners. That was called, Southern Vietnam has historically been called Cochin China. So it actually does have some history of autonomy, but that part of Vietnam became independent, along with Cambodia and Laos. So basically Indochina was cut up into 4 countries. So that was how the United States originally got involved in Indochina, and if the Korean War had not been fought, all of that still would have played out pretty much the same way. The United States still would have been concerned about the rise of communism in France, and in turn, it still would have had an incentive to get involved in Indochina. And of course, by extension, it still would have had an incentive to maintain the stability of the South Vietnamese government. Do you think it's possible that the US would follow the way of other empires in terms of years lasted and probable complete collapse? I don't know how much precedent really applies because we're in such a weird era. Almost all previous empires existed at some point before the year 1800, historically speaking. Uh, there have been, there's been a lot of European empires that really kind of ascended since then, but all of them collapsed by mid-20th century, except for the Russian Empire, which continued to exist in the form of the Soviet Union until 1991. But, since then, there's just been so much technological change and so much economic change, just so much, there's been so much dynamism in the world and the distribution of wealth and power and whatnot that it's kind of hard to take previous precedent and apply it to now. I would really be skeptical of anybody arguing that the United States would last only as long as a European empire did, just because that's the established precedent. It's probably going to evolve in a different way. That's what I would expect anyway.
Yeah, the format of how economies work is very different as well, and how governments relate to each other is also very different, and we have a different power level if you're talking about just raw destructive capacity with nuclear weapons. So the chances that we have like a full out conflict are lower because the quality of life is higher than it's ever been before, and then the ability for us to blow the shit out of ourselves is also higher than ever before. Mm-hmm. So you're not really going to motivate very many people who are watching 4K Netflix to take up arms.
Yeah. Yeah, not really. Yeah, it's just so different now. Also keep in mind that the US has a central role in the global economy that is much larger and more prominent than anything that Europe was able to achieve, even at its peak. Europe was very important to the global economy, certainly, but the United States is just the principal pillar carrying the global economy right now. China is still kind of getting there. They've definitely made a lot of progress, but U.S. consumption is still like the principal driver of the global economy at this point. Chinese consumption is kind of like a distant second. Well, maybe not a distant second, maybe a close second, but still second. So in that sense, I don't think that the United States is as vulnerable to, say, losing colonies that the Europeans were. The United States doesn't need colonies because it's already big in and of itself, and because its commercial reach basically extends to the entire globe. European economies kind of lost competitiveness and had to lean on mercantilist policies that isolated their colonies from other European countries. And so in that sense, they were not really competitive in the long term, like the United States has proven to be. But that doesn't mean that U.S. hegemony is guaranteed. There could be things that happen in the future that undermine it and result in something that some might call the collapse of the American empire, if indeed you want to characterize it as such. But if it does, I don't think it's going to look like what happened with the European empires. I think it's going to be something new. Unprecedented times tend to produce unprecedented results. It's not going to be something that looks familiar, per se. Let's see. Do you see any major problems coming down the road with Ukraine joining NATO? I would if I thought Ukraine was going to join NATO, but I don't. I'm very confident that they will not. Yeah, the thing about NATO is that they have a rule in place that they will not accept as new members, any nation that has an existing territorial dispute. And Ukraine very obviously has existing territorial disputes. So I don't think they're going to let them in. And I think they might even had a hard time applying, because there's a lot of people in Ukraine that are pretty skeptical of NATO. I think generally they're more the ethnic Russians in Ukraine, but I think there's just a lot of residual suspicion left over from the Cold War amongst a lot of people. But yeah, even if they did get enough, even if Kiev did have enough public support to make an application, I'm skeptical that NATO would be willing to let them in, just because, well, besides the rule about the territorial disputes, there's also the fact that it would be taken very negatively in Moscow, to put it mildly. It would be considered a significant escalation on the part of the West vis-a-vis perceived Russian interests. And that would be a problem in and of itself. And I don't know that NATO is all that interested in helping Ukraine as to try to confront Russia over it. Poland might. I think Poland delights in any opportunity to thumb their nose at Russia. So maybe Poland will help them out on a bilateral basis. But beyond that, I don't think NATO as a whole is going to be that interested. It's just too much of a geopolitical uncertainty. Even the United States isn't all that invested in the Ukraine issue. Like, they've given them some non-lethal supplies, and I think more recently they've given them like weapons and other stuff. But overall, the level of support has been relatively tepid. The principal form of interaction between the West and Ukraine thus far has been in terms of trying to encourage them to fight corruption, since that's one of the biggest inhibitors of Ukrainian development and modernization. And there's a sense that if they could just do that, then they would be a much more appealing partner, not only to NATO, but also to the European Union. But man, that's a tall order, because corruption is deeply ingrained in the Ukrainian political culture. So it's going to be difficult to deal with that in any short amount of time. And by the time you do deal with it, the whole issue with Russia may well have changed dramatically in nature or even resolved itself. So yeah, I don't think they're going to join NATO. I think it's just going to be too difficult to meet the criteria in terms of fighting corruption, in terms of territorial disputes. I don't think NATO wants to pick a fight with Russia, and I don't think that the United States really cares enough one way or the other to really pitch in and influence it. So yeah. Now, if they did join NATO, then yeah, obviously that's going to be a problem, because then Russia is going to retaliate somehow. I don't know exactly how. Maybe they would invade eastern Ukraine. They had been talking in 2014 about carving out all the ethnic Russian parts of Ukraine into a new Novorossiya, a kind of new Russian territory that would either be independent or would be annexed into Russia. So technically they still could do that, and I don't know that if they did, even now, that anybody would really do anything about it. Because keep in mind, Ukraine does not have any mutual defense treaties with anybody, really. I think they have some nascent security ties with Georgia, Moldova, and Armenia? Is that what it was? It was called Guam. They had this informal group called Guam. So Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova. What was the A? I'm forgetting the A. It's escaping my memory. So if you know what the A is in chat, let me know. I appreciate it. That's going to bug the hell out of me. Anyway. But yeah, that's not a mutual defense treaty per se either. That's more just a bilateral security agreement where they cooperate, but not necessarily defend each other. So without a mutual defense treaty with a more powerful partner, there's not really much stopping Russia from invading Ukraine, other than the innate cost of occupying new territory and fighting a war. That seems to be the theme today. It's the third time we've mentioned it. But yeah, that's a real deterrent, because I don't think anybody expects an invasion like that to be a complete walkover. Even if the Ukrainian army were defeated on the field, there would still be significant insurgent activity. And across a country as large and populous as Ukraine, it would be very difficult and expensive to try to hold down the country with a pure military occupation. So that would be a deterrent. But if Ukraine did try to join NATO, certainly they would seriously consider it anyway, if only just to secure that southwestern flank of Russia. Let's see, what is the biggest threat to secular rule in the U.S.? I don't really see it as actually being all that threatened. I think in general it's still pretty resilient.
Wouldn't, by definition, it have to be something religious by the definition of the term secular?
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of what I mean. I mean, there's not, I don't think, any significant. I mean, there are definitely evangelical Christians in the United States, and there's definitely far-right nationalists that are Christian nationalist in character who would prefer to break down the barrier between church and state. But in general, these groups don't have a lot of traction.
Isn't that called Christian dominionist?
Oh, Actually, you would know better than me. Is that what it's called?
I believe that's what it's called. Christian
Christian
dominionists
Dominionist. Okay.
who believe not only that Christianity is the best, but Christianity should rule in the United States.
Ah,
And that
so I guess
people,
these are,
we have some, like, you could say aspects of this that are just a part of our just normal operations. Like one of them is you swear on the Bible in court. That's something that is like a Christian specific. They can give you an alternative and that kind of a thing, but that would be kind of a Christian first approach to things. And then changing the things that are in textbooks. Like there are some schools in Texas, I think we talked about this, where they're removing stuff about evolution because they see that as an affront to God kind of a thing. And it's not that all Christians are prioritizing their government in these sorts of ways. So a lot of them are happy about the church and state separation, but Christian dominionists would be specifically trying to put stuff in the state government that is favorable to the church and the power of the church. The tricky thing and the reason why it's not like a takeover of U.S. government is because there's so many different subsets of Christianity, so many different denominations and so on, that they're not all part of one overarching church. Like the Catholic Church is pretty huge, and that's part of the reason why they have as much power and influence as they do, is because they're all beholden to the Pope and the cardinals in that hierarchy. But for Protestants, less so.
yeah. Yeah, I don't think they have sufficient political support or even really organization to significantly threaten the secular nature of U.S. politics. Now, at a local level, they might be able to. But I mean, if you live in a community where religion has always been a big part of day-to-day life and even politics, it doesn't seem like that big of a threat to national politics as a whole if you incorporate religion at that level, at that local level. You know, even when there was like a big court case decades ago in which Bible study was forbidden from public schools, which was very upsetting to a lot of conservatives, you know, who wanted to maintain that institution. But even then, they just basically circumvented that restriction by having religious studies classes. Guess what they studied in the religious studies classes?
The Bible.
Yeah, technically they had to study other religions too, but they would dedicate like an hour to the other ones, and then everything else would just be Christianity. So it's not as though there's not already uh, basically a de facto allowance of study of religion and incorporation of religion into public institutions at a local level. And I don't think, again, that that's necessarily a threat because they've just always been that way. You know, it's not, it would be a change for them to remove that from their public life and to remove that from their institutions. And I don't know that it would necessarily be an improvement if they did. I mean, even if you could manage to force them to, they would probably just find another way around it, find some other loophole or what have you, or just send everybody to private schools, which they've done before. That happened in the South after the Civil Rights Movement. There was a big push to integrate the schools because if you lived in like a white community, then you would have the white school, and if you lived in a black community, you would have the black school. So what integration was about was trying to just have everybody go to the same school rather than just having arbitrary, racially defined schools. So there was a bunch of court cases about that, and technically, you know, schools across the South were supposed to integrate. But instead, what happened in a lot of cases is that a lot of white communities in the South took their kids out of the public education system entirely and just sent them to private schools. And those private schools were quote unquote selective about the kids that they took in. You can probably guess which type of kids they disproportionately allowed. They also had relatively high tuition in order to act as, an additional barrier to prevent African American students from gaining admission. So in that sense, there's a lot of de facto segregation that persevered even after public schools were technically supposed to be officially integrated. So similar circumventions could happen with religion if you ever actually did manage to fully separate and forbid any kind of religion in things like public schools. Just at a local level where it's like 99% support of religion in schools, you really just can't stop them unless you just implement like really draconian measures. So the real question is not necessarily what's the biggest threat to secular rule in the United States. I think more the question is what's the biggest threat to secular rule at the national level, because we already have it to a degree at the local level in certain places. And again, at the national level, I just don't see it. Like they just don't have the support. And in general, the religious right is very far from their peak of power. There was a big upsurge in evangelical sentiment in the 1980s. That was the big religious revival. And a lot of that was spearheaded by televangelists who had no qualms about getting into politics. Historically, before that, there had kind of been a unofficial barrier between religion and politics that priests and preachers didn't generally cross. They tried to be relatively apolitical, but televangelists in the 80s kind of changed that. And since then, religious actors have been more willing, relatively speaking, to dip into political discourse and debate. So, that being the case, yeah, religion is just hard, basically, just to fully separate. But that was the peak of their power. That's what I was trying to say. In the 1980s, that was the peak of their power. But they've been weakening ever since then. The televangelists were largely discredited in the 90s. A lot of them were pretty corrupt. And so evangelical Christianity has kind of continued to proliferate. It's hardly disappeared. It's still relevant. But its political power has been significantly curtailed since then, such that I don't think that they could realistically threaten the secular nature of American politics.
Have you
So maybe
ever
that.
have you ever
Go
heard of
ahead.
the prosperity gospel?
I have. That's got deep roots in the United States.
Yes. It's pretty funny. I saw a video recently of this lady who's moving into a super, super wealthy neighborhood in California, I think, or something. And she was talking about it as this was God giving her the mission to infiltrate the wealthy and to bring them to Jesus. It's like, okay. I guess I'll
Yeah,
put more in the offering bin here for you.
that's a very American take on Christianity.
Yeah.
Well, technically, the United States could be argued anyway to be the most powerful merchant republic in the history of mankind. So maybe not a shock then that we're a little predisposed towards perspectives that emphasize prosperity.
That's actually bringing me back to a point we made earlier of how whenever you import some manner of thinking, some kind of religion or ideology, it doesn't usually stamp out everything that was there before. It gets blended. And I'm thinking of how one of the main things that is distinctly American is work hard, earn money. And that's a big part of it. When Jesus was in the Bible and stuff, was he like work hard, earn money, get bread, get a nice watch? I don't think he said that. But if you're in the US and you hear American-ish stuff and then you hear something about God a few moments later, then people will just start to link the two in their head. And they won't really assess on a personal level, hey, does this fit with the overarching philosophy of Jesus? They just feel like, okay, this is an authority figure who I trust, who says a lot of stuff that I agree with. So if they're saying this too, and they're rich because they've just been so blessed, then, wow, that's great.
Let's see. I guess to be fair to the questioner here, locally unseen, the question is actually relative. So it's not necessarily what is the threat to secular rule in the United States, but rather what is the biggest threat. So I guess of the threats that exist, and again, I don't think any of them are really all that major. I guess the biggest one, I guess it would still be technically televangelists. They're still they're still the ones that dip the most into politics and that incorporate politics the most into their sermons. But again, I'm not that afraid of them at this point. Let's see. Next question. How is Switzerland so good at avoiding wars and conflicts? I mean, it helps that they're just kind of on a mountain.
Yeah, geography is a major factor.
Yeah,
Makes your territory more defensible. You could also say, why has the U.S. not been invaded that many times? And it's like, well, you got an ocean to either side and nice Canadians to the north. So the number of locations you can be attacked from is fairly low. You could
yeah,
ask a similar question of why has Poland been invaded so many times? Just look at where it is geographically. You could sweep from the
exactly.
east or the west. So, yeah, Switzerland's kind of like an opposite of Poland in terms of just accessibility. A big
Yeah,
part of
it's not,
war, you've said this quote before, it's like amateurs talk about strategy,
yeah,
someone talks about
aficionados.
tactics, aficionados talk about tactics, and professionals talk about logistics. When people think about war, they think about the firing of the tank. They don't think about the rolling of the tank way the fuck over there to go to battle. But if you don't roll the tank over there, then it can't actually shoot the stuff. And that's a really key part of military operations in general, is being able to get the people and the guns to the spot and the aid and everything else.
Exactly. Yeah, you got to go out of your way to get to Switzerland to a degree. And also, just there's not much there that's desirable per se. Like, what do you get if you conquer Switzerland? Mountains? I mean,
Some of the best skiing in the world.
some of the best skiing in the world. Yeah, there's that. But there's just not a lot of like really valuable natural resources there that would make it attractive. I mean, it today it has like some giant corporations and stuff that are based out of it, but hundreds of years ago they didn't have that. Switzerland was mostly just like isolated villages living in located in river, not river, but ravines. So there was just not a lot of incentive to go out of your way to conquer Switzerland. It just wasn't that attractive in the grand scheme of things. So between the logistical difficulty, the difficulty of the terrain, the geography, and the lack of resources, it has not necessarily been hard for Switzerland to avoid conquest. I think it was a little bit harder when they first became independent because they were originally a part of the oh, what was it? They were originally a part of the Holy Roman Empire, and specifically, they were a part of one of the stem duchies that founded the Holy Roman Empire. I don't think I can remember which one, though. It's not Franconia. That's going to bug me too. I don't remember exactly. But basically, they were a part of one of the duchies that comprised the Holy Roman Empire. They revolted, and then they formed the Confederation. And there were some attempts by that duchy to try to take the territory back, just because it had been theirs, technically, legally speaking. But they were not able to do so. And so you could say one of the ways that the Swiss were able to avoid being conquered is because they were so proficient at, well, because they were themselves such proficient pikemen. Normally, if you wanted to raise an army of pikemen, it cost you a lot of money. And money was pretty hard to get back in the day. You had to get money either through tax revenue from cities or you had to borrow it. Either way, paying a bunch of dudes money was difficult for anything but some of the wealthier kings. Now, what the Swiss had going for them is that they had a collective they had a, what would you call it? They had a collective desire to defend themselves from the duchy in question. And so what they had was a lot of volunteers who were able to basically form what you would call now a militia to come out and defend themselves from the knights of the duchy. So it's much easier to form a large army of pikemen when you're able to just get volunteers, basically. And also, beyond just being cheap and being able to mobilize a large army relatively quickly, they also had the advantage of being actually pretty disciplined, effective fighters. Being able to form an army of pikemen is one thing, but having them be actually well trained enough in order to stop a cavalry charge and to be able to win a battle, that's something else. And the Swiss were able to actually do that. They actually fielded a successful army that was able to beat successive waves of knights in several battles. to the point where I actually saw, I don't remember what YouTube video it was, but they were recounting basically Swiss pikemen in general. And in one of the battles, they were able to successfully defeat one wave of knights. And rather than retreating, which in retrospect is what they should have done, they actually charged. They actually moved forward because they wanted to keep fighting because they thought they could beat the entire, army of dudes that they were up against. And they ended up losing because they ended up just getting overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But they certainly exacted a disproportionate toll on their opponent. So very effective fighters, cheap and quickly mobilized armies, and then confidence, certainly. They were actually so effective and were able to engender such a reputation for effectiveness as pikemen that Swiss mercenaries became famous throughout Europe. And actually, the Pope today technically still uses Swiss mercenaries. The ceremonial guards in the Vatican, I think, are all technically Swiss mercenaries. Although at this point, it may be more about the costume than actual, combat training. But technically, that's where the costumes and whatnot came from. They were originally Swiss mercenaries. I guess another factor that's worth mentioning here is that the rest of Europe was willing to cooperate with allowing them to be neutral. Hypothetically, this, that, or the other empire builder could have just invaded them for the sake of it, but by and large, even aggressive expansionists have been willing to just kind of let Switzerland go. Hitler thought about it. He didn't like Switzerland, but he also didn't really want to go to the trouble of invading them. Napoleon actually did invade Switzerland. He actually successfully invaded Switzerland and conquered it, and he actually carved it into a new country called the Helvetic Republic, if I remember correctly. Yeah, you'd think they might be relatively popular since they implemented a number of liberal reforms, but some of the more conservative traditionalists in Switzerland were not on board with it, and there ended up being a lot of fighting between the new government and them. Well, let's see. I think that's all we had for questions for the moment. And I think we've still got, what, 20 minutes left?
Yeah, sure.
Let's see. Let me find some more stuff here. Oh yeah, Iran. Can I grab some water real quick?
Yes, sir.
Thank
Hydration
you.
is key. Man, what a cruel show host. And the guest just like, "Sir, I'm parched. I've been talking for 2 hours. Can I have some water?" No. You cannot. But sir. Talk about what yet? Is that a meme? Appreciate you hanging out tonight, Chad. Do you have a podcast, Mr. Talking Man? Yes, it's called World Discussion with Agent Smith. It's hosted at twitch.tv/Neuro every Sunday in the evening. And you're here. You found it. Good job. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Homestar10, and you are now tuned in to Agent Smith's podcast, World Discussion, History, the World, and Cryptocurrency.
Sorry for the delay.
Apology accepted. Forgiven granted. Forgiveness granted. Hydration in progress.
Yes. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about Iran. I think I mentioned them a little bit last time. They were with regard to the nuclear negotiations specifically. And I think I also mentioned the assassination attempt on the prime minister.
Hmm.
Do you remember that at all?
Hmm.
I'm having trouble remembering myself.
I think so.
Okay. So let's see. So the two new items I would bring up, one also has to do with the nuclear negotiation. So just recently, I was reading just this past week that there was an envoy sent to Iran to discuss the Iranian removal of surveillance equipment from nuclear facilities, which were supposed to be under surveillance according to the nuclear deal. And apparently, that envoy has now left Iran because they could not reach an agreement. So this is just a further deterioration, basically, in Iranian adherence to the deal. And that could have potential consequences if the other members of the deal, specifically Germany, Russia, China, India, etc., if they think that the Iranians are not sufficiently adhering to it, then they could themselves snap back sanctions into place. The US obviously still has its own sanctions, which it implemented again, I think, in 2017, whenever it was. So nothing new there, but certainly if Iran continues to flout the deal, then they're going to have a lot more economic problems to deal with, given that these other countries will start implementing their own sanctions again. So that's a trend to keep an eye on. And then there was also, at the end of October, I actually didn't talk about this when it happened, but at the end of October, there was a drone attack on US troops stationed in southern Syria. In southern Syria, which is mostly desert and mostly unpopulated, there is a town called Al Tanf. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but that's my best effort. There's a town called Al Tanf, which the Syrian government was never able to take back. And that's partly because the US and the Jordanian government, if not also other GCC governments, have basically propped up rebels there, as well as having their own troops deployed there. So Al Tanf and the surrounding territory has been a bastion of Syrian rebels for many years now. So the garrison there was attacked by some Iranian drones. The drones themselves were from Iran, but the government, that is to say the US government, does not believe they were being operated by the Iranians. They suspect that the Iranians gave the drones to some local, well, either the Syrian government or some local militia affiliated with the Syrian government, one or the other. Regardless, the drones were used to attack U.S. troops on base, as well as Syrian rebels, among others. So that was a pretty bold move, and I was expecting some retaliation, but I don't think I've read any yet on the part of the United States. So it could be that Biden is just biding his time, but or maybe we have done something and it just hasn't been publicized. Maybe something done clandestinely. Or it could have been done by Israel, because Israel's actually been launching pretty regular airstrikes into Syria, targeting the Iranians and their allied militias that are in Syria. So it could have been that the US just used Israel as its proxy there, and that was the retaliation. It's not entirely clear. But regardless, Iran has been getting more aggressive in the past few months. Between the attempted assassination on the prime minister of Iraq, which was also done with drones, the drone attack here in southern Syria, and then also some of the cheating going on in the nuclear deal. All of that suggests a relatively hawkish Iranian government, which we knew would happen. The Raisi administration was expected to be much more hawkish and conservative. But now we're starting to see some specific manifestations of that. And it's not clear what they hope to gain here. Uh, I expect that they may be trying to apply pressure to the United States, broadly speaking, in order to try to extract concessions in the nuclear negotiations, but I also don't think that's going to work. So I'm not sure. I guess what you could call this is a low risk, low reward. I don't think they really expect the United States to start a war over any of this stuff. So just kind of agitating the United States on the off chance that they might get concessions could be a more effective strategy than doing nothing and being guaranteed of no sanctions relief. So in that sense, they're just kind of backed into a corner and doing uh, applying desperate strategies for lack of alternative options. Being a hawkish administration, they're going to be pretty risk tolerant in that regard. So maybe not surprising, but I'm not sure what the end game is going to be here. They can't be too aggressive because we saw what happened with the Trump administration back in 2020, where the Soleimani assassination was the retaliation for similar such attacks. I don't think the Biden administration is going to do something quite so belligerent, but probably it will hit back if there's a significant attack on U.S. interests in the region.
You said almost Biden is Biden his time, and I was excited for all the dads who might be listening at that joke.
Almost, but not quite. Sorry to disappoint.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the main focus is still on nuclear weapons. If the Iranian government really looks like it's going to try for a breakout, that is to say, a rush to develop nuclear weapons in just a few months, I think then there could be some serious foreign policy fireworks. But it's not clear yet that that's what they're trying to do. They could be laying the groundwork to do it. But even that could just be a form of bluffing. They could just be trying to take those steps to try to scare the United States into giving concessions. The implicit threat being that they would basically that they would try for a breakout later once their foundation for doing so was stronger. Anybody's guess at this point. But that's been the drama with Iran lately. It's getting a little more aggressive. Let's see, are we doing okay on time, or are you waiting for me?
Nope, I'm in a match. You can go. Do flags, correct.
Let's see. May not have much else. I think somebody last time pointed out, we were talking about the economy, and I was arguing that the economy was doing pretty good in the United States, and some of the evidence I pointed to was that wages are going up. But somebody in chat pointed out that inflation has also been going up, such that real wages have actually been deteriorating. And that's actually true. So real wages are actually falling a bit. Not a whole lot yet, but technically they are falling. So one could argue that that is evidence of an economy that is not doing as well as it might seem. But I still think it's overall doing pretty strong. Like output is up, and a bunch of other indicators are in the green. So I think overall the trend is definitely positive. Oh, the Philippines election. Yeah, that's right. The president of the Philippines right now is Duterte. And he's, of course, a very controversial political figure, not only in the Philippines, but outside of the Philippines as well. So he can't run for re-election because of term limits, if I'm not mistaken. So there's some question as to what's going to happen, because obviously he's still pretty popular. So he has the option, basically, of kind of running through a proxy. So some expected that proxy to be his daughter, who has kind of flirted with the prospect of getting involved in politics, but hasn't ever really committed, at least not yet. So that's still, I think, pretty ambiguous. But Duterte has come out and said he would run for vice president in the upcoming election. So he's still going to be involved in politics, but that still leaves open the question of who runs for president. Now, I think the last news I remember from the Philippines is that Duterte's daughter, I don't have her name here in my notes, so I don't quite recall it. But his daughter was actually negotiating with the son, I believe, of Ferdinand Marcos to be a running mate in the upcoming election for president. And for those of you who don't know who Ferdinand Marcos was, he was dictator of the Philippines from roughly I want to say like 1960 to 1980 something. Basically, he was dictator for about 30 years, a very long time. And so he's obviously a controversial figure in the Philippines. So for the controversial president's daughter to be in talks with the son of a previous dictator is kind of interesting at the very least. I don't know that Marcos's son is necessarily like a very charismatic figure like his father was. So, maybe this is more about symbolism than anything. Marcos still has his supporters in the Philippines, even though he was a dictator. So this could be more about trying to rally the charismatic vote, if you will, people who are attracted to charismatic politicians. So that could be effective in the upcoming election, but I'm not sure if there's any significance beyond that, at least at this juncture. Oh yeah, people were talking in chat a couple months ago about the gaming ban in China. Do you remember this?
I remember that they classified uh, gaming addiction as a legit medical thing, but I don't remember about a gaming ban.
Yeah, basically that's it. Basically kids are not supposed to game during the work week, uh, and they're only allowed to game. Well, there's like a narrow window that they can game in during the work week,
Hmm.
and then there's a, cap to the amount of time that they can play within a given week as well. And so, like you say, one of the ways that they were going to enforce that is to require identification in order to log into a game so that they could keep track of you. Now, I think in chat, one of the some of the points that they missed was that for one, people would get around that ban before by just using their parents' ID.
Mm-hmm.
So not necessarily that difficult to play as much as you want, so long as you don't mind switching accounts. Uh, but then also, the government is looking at facial recognition technology to verify IDs going forward. So that could be one way that they stop people from circumventing the rule in the same way that they were before. Because even if you're using your parents' ID, you would still have your face recognized.
If
So
they
in that,
if they put a cap on gaming time, doesn't that incentivize cheesy play?
one could argue as such. I suppose it would.
They're trying to weed out macro players, I'm telling you. If you have 15-minute macro games and you're just taking bases and defensing them, that's great, but you're going to hit your gaming time cap after like 4 to 8 games. But if you cheese people in 5 minutes or less, you get more matches. They need to think about these things.
Well, I don't think that the Chinese government has done research on that particular aspect of the problem. Perhaps you should advise them. You could make a little money on the side there.
I would think they would have a little bit more national pride about it. I know it's always a controversial issue between gamers and non-gamers of whether or not time spent gaming is time well spent. Some people will just say straight up it's not a good expenditure of time. But then you have a lot of the, say, Dota scene in China, where China fields a lot of super strong Dota 2 teams who make it super deep and win tournaments and get huge amounts of money from this. And you can argue about what the players get versus what the teams get all day long, but I think gaming is cool. Hot take. I think I think moderating your gaming time is important. And it kind of fits with how their government tends to work too, if they like issuing mandates and missives and telling people what they can and can't do. In the US, I think people would get rather upset, even if the parents agreed that, yes, our children are playing too many video games, but don't tell me what to do.
Oh, I think, okay, we did get a couple more questions here at the end. Do you want to try them or do you want to save them for next time?
Hey, dude.
Let's see. Are there cautionary tales for the US to learn from modern Venezuela? I mean, yes, in so much as, implementing price controls and aggravating a powerful neighbor is bad for your economy, then yeah, but I think that stuff was already pretty obvious for most people in the United States. Um, Maybe a better lesson would be that it's better to have a good ground game politically, be able to organize people at a grassroots level, and so that you can have a coherent opposition. That's something that the opposition in Venezuela has categorically failed to do. And as a result, they've been very dysfunctional in their attempts to defeat the Venezuelan government, so to speak, either violently or at the polls. They haven't been very successful at either. But yeah, I think there are lessons, but they're all just very obvious. I don't think there's any like secrets that anybody was unaware of there. Let's see. And then with the Omicron variant popping up all across the world now, how will it affect travel and policies? Predictably so. I mean, basically, they're just going to, countries affected, if they have big outbreaks, will implement lockdowns, and then they'll probably also implement travel restrictions again. That's already happened to South Africa. The South African government was complaining that they went out of their way to, do research on the new variant and test for it and discover it. And, when they released the findings, they were immediately met with a bunch of travel restrictions that are going to hurt their economy. So they kind of felt a little bit punished for good behavior there. But yeah, that would be my expectation. If it is more contagious than previous variants, there's probably going to be another gaggle of travel restrictions implemented. It's going to differ by country. I imagine some countries are just going to kind of throw up their hands and say, whatever, we can't stop it anyway. Other countries have been pretty averse to taking strong actions on COVID regardless, United States being a principal example. I guess we've taken some strong actions, but it's varied considerably from state to state. Europe, in general, Europe will probably do travel restrictions, but I think some countries have polities that are getting a little worn out from travel restrictions and lockdowns, so they might be more interested in doing something like a semi-quasi lockdown or travel restrictions. Basically, not complete restrictions, but basically restrictions that allow some travel and some activity with some exceptions. Basically, just to make things easier on people. But yeah, I don't think it's going to impact things in an unpredictable way.
Yeah, probably some similarities with whenever the Delta variant popped up. We had
Yeah.
COVID is kind of like the Brexit of health, where you think it's winding down. It's like, yeah, it's they're just finishing up the last bits of it. People are either getting sick and getting better, or they're getting vaccinated, and it's going to be fine. But then this new thing comes up, and it's going to take way longer to get through than we expected. So the assessment, and if Will Blur is here, if you see the comments, a lot of people are talking about COVID moving into the category of just an endemic illness where the human species just continues to carry it and it kind of bounces around and mutates, but we don't eliminate it entirely because it mutates faster than we can just make it go extinct, pretty much. Mm-hmm. So given that that's the case, you're going to have more of a level of like awareness of health and safety. I could kind of draw a comparison almost between what happened with travel with the 9/11 attacks and how the security level of airports just changed. Like there was a lot more stuff that you have to do to get to your flight than you had to do before then, but then it stayed like that since that crisis. So yeah. Like people just having masks at home that they can wear out if they have to as being more of a wardrobe item for people, and having better awareness of like washing your hands and things like that. So we'll have to be more health conscious. And if you're looking at history too, there have been pandemics in the past, and there are going to be pandemics in the future. The question is, when is it bad enough that we need to have like lockdowns or something like that, which definitely depends on who you ask.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, that's all for questions. So thank you for giving me the opportunity there.
Thank you, Moss Neotech, for handling the questions tonight, and thank you, chat, for your contributions as usual. If you have any comments from the YouTube, feel free. These will get posted and then they will be read. I just posted an episode yesterday, so I'll try to crank out this one, or the previous one and this one a little bit faster. But I'm glad you survived your Thanksgiving feast and you feasted well.
Yeah, sure did.
Did you do your walk?
How was your Thanksgiving?
Did you do your walk?
I did. I did it today, this afternoon.
Oh, procrastinator. But still counts. Good job. Yeah, mine was good. I don't have as much family in the state that I used to. My parents moved to South Dakota and my brother moved to Texas, so I was hanging out with apoptosis throughout the day. And it was a family who I had never met before, but they had many similar traditions, so I didn't feel too out of place. Just tried to make myself useful and do some dishes here and there, help out in the kitchen here and there. It helps with my guilt of like if I just showed up and just ate food and didn't contribute at all.
Yeah, I can sympathize. You don't want to just come off and eat their food and be like, "Okay, thanks, bye."
Yeah. But it would still be tasty if you did that.
It would. Oh, by the way, have you ever heard of a game called Shadow Empire?
No? What's that about?
It's a strategy game, I guess. It's not, it's kind of it's a 4X builder, pretty much, but it's kind of a unique one. It's got an immense amount of depth. It came with like a 370 plus page manual that I've been trying to read through for the past week. It's pretty interesting. I don't know if it's your cup of tea, but you might check it out.
I've been enjoying Age of Empires, the new game.
Oh yeah, how is that?
It's good. I didn't play Age of Empires 2 or 3 or whatever the previous ones were that much, but it's got a lot of the fun of managing a bunch of different things as StarCraft, but it doesn't quite have the same like vicious lethality that StarCraft does, where you have more time to get up your initial build and get your villagers going. And the overall atmosphere of the game is more cozy and peaceful because you've got like people chopping wood, people getting berries, and you have that historical aspect of, instead of you having spaceships and teleportation technology and all this, you've got pikemen, you've got knights, and these different power spikes that can happen. One of the cheeses that many people have been saying is really busted is a battering ram all in, where you just tech rush up to battering rams and you just go and kill the two main facilities, like the one or two main facilities of your opponent. So it's a new game. It's not quite as balanced, and it's not really made to be a competitive spectator esport the same as StarCraft was, but definitely a good game.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I've heard of it before, but this is like the newest iteration.
Yes.
Gotcha.
And it's rather polished. It does have its bugs, and it's not perfectly balanced, but definitely a good game.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you for the recommendation.
Hell yeah.
All right, man. Well, thank you again for letting me on. Always a privilege. Much appreciated.
You take care of yourself. Do another 20-minute walk. Got him again. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with 25-Minute Walk Smith.
Thank you very much. See you next time.
Take care. And that's a wrap.